Hello and welcome. I'm Frederick Dunn, and today's guest is Maggie Shanahan. Maggie is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Minnesota's Department of Entomology. I invited Maggie for an interview after reading her article that was published in Entomology Today. The title of the article was Honeybee Health and Industrial Agriculture: What Researchers Are Missing and Why It's a Problem. Here's Maggie.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Maggie, and I'm a bee researcher and beekeeper, currently a PhD candidate in the Spivak lab at the University of Minnesota. And I study the way honeybees and stingless bees use propolis to keep their colony healthy. And I also examine the impacts of industrial agriculture on honeybee health in the US.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm really glad that you joined us today. And a lot of the viewers are backyard beekeepers. And the reason you got my attention and why I asked, and I'm so glad that you accepted my invitation, was regarding the Journal of Insect Science article that you wrote that was published this month, by the way, so it's fresh information. For those that are watching, there's also a link down in the video description to show Maggie's PowerPoint presentation. It's very interesting. It's on YouTube. I highly recommend it. And so the big picture, a lot of people that are keeping bees like to run to specific solutions for their bees themselves without looking at the contributing factors that might negatively impact the bees, as well as what they could be doing to positively impact those. And the reason I really liked what you were doing is because you referred to the bees as a canary in the coal mine, but rather than improving the environment in which we're keeping the canary or responding to its poor health, we're resuscitating it. And I love that analogy. And would you please just explain a little more about how that came about and why you're looking at it that way?
Yeah, so one thing that I think happens, in beekeeping and as well in bee research, like you're saying, is we can get kind of narrowly focused on what's happening inside the hive. And we're so committed to addressing honeybee health problems, that we're doing everything we can to address, the really specific issues that we observe inside the bee box. Sometimes we get so laser focused on those issues that we miss the broader context. It's harder for us to see what are the root causes of the issues that we're seeing that are showing up inside of our colonies. So I use this canary in the coal mine metaphor to sort of examine that issue and say, there's only so much we can do for this canary, for honeybees in the current conditions that they're in. Mm-hmm. What we really need to do is address those conditions. We need to address the coal mine issue, the environment that the honeybees are in, industrial agriculture, which is contributing to colony loss. Like, we need to take a step back and make some bigger change.
Hmm. Well, and you have a background in organic farming and organic produce. So without pesticides and without chemical interventions in agriculture on a smaller scale, and you're currently down in Mexico. Is that right?
Yeah, my current research and current life is based in Chiapas, Mexico, so southern Mexico. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not black and white because not all industrial farmers are doing it wrong, and so there are a lot of ways that we can practice farming that also preserves the environment in a way that sustains a broader range of wildlife species. Not just, as you said, we're focused in on the honeybee. We're focused in on honeybee health inside the hive. And it's kind of one of the things that I think is great when people do get involved in honeybees and beekeeping, is the spinoff of that is they become more aware of the environment, how it is positively or negatively impacting the bees. And I really liked your comparison in your presentation there. But again, sometimes we look at it and we go, well, the way the bees are being migrated around in trucks impacts their health because they're feeding off of monocultures and things like that. Are you at all affiliated with, or do you reach out to industrial scale beekeepers or farmers, and do you derive some better information from them, or do you see some of them heading in a better direction now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, people at all scales are looking for creative ways to make changes to support bee health and moving in the ways
Mhm.
that they can, given, the particular conditions of each person's situation. Some of the propolis research that we do is in collaboration with these large scale beekeepers, migratory beekeepers looking for ways to support bee health and being totally open to changing practices.
Mhm.
Um, I see that across the board, both in large scale beekeeping and also in large scale farming. I think there is a lot of openness there. And my approach with this paper, this analysis about industrial agriculture, is when we step back and we look at the whole system and we can understand the way each of us as an individual is embedded in that system, um, we get a better perspective, we get more information about opportunities for change. And for me, industrial beekeeping does have negative implications for honeybees, and it's a part of this larger system of industrial farming. So what can we do as individuals, as beekeepers, as researchers to shed light on those issues?
Mhm.
And how can we take action then to, it's like, it's not a small change, management change is helpful, and it's food system change that we ultimately need to shoot for.
Mhm. So what's wrong with migrating bees around in trucks by the thousands to, say, the pollination services for almond groves? Um, we know that we can't. It's part of our income when it comes to as a nation for agriculture. So it's not easy to turn that ship around because it's really on a kind of a set path. And there's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of money to be earned, which is kind of the double-bladed sword aspect of this, is that the fact that it gets so much attention economically is why we're even paying attention to it. Where if everyone were just organic backyard beekeepers, we wouldn't have any national support, right?
Mm.
So so when we look at that, um, we can't tell people to stop doing that and probably don't want them to, but we would like to see them take micro steps towards better management of land and resources in partnership with benefiting pollinators and those managed colonies like honeybees, because there are other species that they're looking at also to help pollinate, like the solitary bees, orchard bees, and things like that. Do you have any experience with orchard bees and trying to establish resident pollinators rather than migratory services?
I don't have a lot of direct experience with that.
Yeah.
I do have concerns about bringing any kind of pollinator into that monocrop system,
Mhm.
with the agrochemicals. It's just not an environment designed to help any kind of pollinator thrive.
Mhm.
So when I see, discussions about, okay, well, honeybees are, there's unsustainable colony loss, and this is a really big issue. We should maybe substitute honeybees with another pollinator. Um, I think that's also, missing the bigger issue of like the environment being the problem. How can we create farming systems that support wild pollinators so that they can thrive, so that we don't then need to supplement our pollination service with any kind of external management. Let's manage the land, like you say. Let's manage our farming
Mhm.
systems. Let's think in that kind of way. Let's take on that kind of project rather than, for me, bringing in alternative managed pollinators feels like another Band-Aid, feels like another temporary fix.
Mhm. Well, by bringing in other pollinators, you mean like the solitary bees? I realize I threw you a wild card there because it's not kind of in your wheelhouse of what you're researching, but it just came to mind.
Yeah, one thing I think about, so I do honeybee research in Minnesota, and down here in Mexico, I do stingless bee research, and stingless bees are, another social honey producing bee native to tropical areas, found on 5
Mhm.
different continents. Just a really really beautiful set of bees, really diverse group of bees, very deeply connected to a lot of indigenous cultures in Mexico and other parts of the world.
Mhm.
And one thing I see in stingless bee research is an increasing interest in finding ways to manage stingless bees for pollination services.
Mhm.
And I see that, and I see, the way this is played out for honeybees in the US. And I feel concerned about that dynamic, like I don't think bringing bees into industrial agriculture environments is good for them. And I think we should, change the environment, not try to change the bee.
Okay, that's interesting. So a lot of people are going to have questions about the stingless bees that you're talking about. And I do get questions about those, and they're like, hey, Fred, you should talk to somebody in New Zealand or Australia about the stingless bees.
Yeah.
Can we make a comparison between Apis mellifera and then the stingless bees, like colony size? What kind of products are they big honey producers, or is it just specifically pollination that we're looking at them for? Why the focus? And of course, as you've mentioned before, the stingless bees are not prone to the same diseases that, including the Varroa destructor mite, for example, would not migrate to the stingless bees. So there are benefits already kind of built into them as a species to where they're not going to be dealing with the problems that we have with Apis mellifera, keeping them going. So biologically, what are the big differences as a colony between stingless and Apis mellifera?
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, stingless bees as a group are, very diverse. So we have stingless bees on the larger size, close in size to Apis mellifera. And then we have these tiny bees, tiny stingless bees that live in tiny nests, that build their nests like in a hollow stem. In such a small cavity, you can't really imagine a whole colony making a life in there. So they're very, very diverse. And many species are managed, and many, many more species aren't managed. A lot of the managed species nest in hollow tree cavities and then can be transferred to, standardized wood box hives. They build their combs differently. Their horizontal combs looks like a stack of pancakes. It's not anything like, biologically they've got similarities to honeybees in that they're also social, and then they're also, just so different. The honey that they produce has a much higher water content and much different flavor. And that honey will vary based on the species that produces it, and then also the flowers that are in the environment. And honey is produced in much smaller amounts in stingless bee colonies. Some colonies will produce 200 milliliters in a year. And others will produce, 2 to 5 liters, but it's not a big honey production enterprise for sure. A lot of stingless bee honey is used medicinally, not necessarily as a sweetener. It's not always sweet. Can be very acidic.
So can you give some examples of medicinal use for that honey?
Yeah, so honey from some stingless bees is used, is applied to the eyes, like in eye drop form, and used to treat, I'm gonna have an issue here with a Spanish-English translation. I'm not sure if they're cataracts, but it's like the cloudiness that develops on the surface of the eye. Stingless bee honey can treat eye conditions and also bacterial issues that come up in the eyes, as one example.
And we're not encouraging people to try that. We're just talking about
right. Not a doctor here.
Right.
That's not medical advice.
But that is really interesting. And it's also interesting that you said the comb. That sounds almost like the way the Vespids would do, that they, create those terraced comb structures. So is it similar to wasp, like paper wasp, only instead it's wax?
I see some similarities with bumblebee nests, actually.
Okay.
Just in the way that they cluster their food resources around the hive. So, in honeybees, the same kind of comb is storing food and brood. In stingless bees, it's these brood combs surrounded by these large honey and pollen pots. And interestingly, for me, all of the construction material, well, almost all the construction material that stingless bees use in their nest, it's not pure wax. It's a mixture of wax and resin. And so these colonies are just enveloped and infused with resin all through their environment.
So then that
Propolis, right?
resin, so is the resin similar at all to propolis that we're talking about?
Yeah. So I use resin as a more general term, but to mean basically propolis. So like
Okay.
honeybees, stingless bees collect resin from plants and trees, bring it inside their colony where they turn it into propolis. They process it a small amount and then incorporate it into different nest structures. And it's a really big part of their nest environment.
And can you give me an idea of the scale of the nest?
Oh, that varies a lot too. So we've
Yeah.
got bees like Melipona, which are closer to the size of Apis mellifera. The brood nest is maybe going to be like this in a colony that's a good size. It's going to vary so much. You could have like an 8-year-old colony in a hollow tree that's massive, right? But something like this, and then you'll have the brood comb, and then you'll have the food stores, and maybe a little bit of space in the nest cavity outside of that.
And for example, like where I live in Pennsylvania, we have winter, so we have this seasonal decline in brood, and then in the spring they build up again. But given the climate where you are, does that mean that the cycle of reproduction is kind of continuous through the entire year, or does it have a seasonal cycle of reduction and expansion?
Yeah, where we are, the queens are laying all year long, but there is a period of dearth. And for us, that occurs during the rainy season when there are less food resources out on the landscape. So the colony does, compress in some ways, get smaller, and then really ramps up. Actually, around this time of year, we're in the dry season now, lots of stuff in bloom.
That's really interesting. So now can you take us back to some of what you learned at the lab where Marla Spivak is? And she's at University of Minnesota, is that right?
Yep. And although I am physically based in Mexico, I am still a PhD candidate in Marla's lab, and I've been there for 4 or 5 years. And then actually had a stint working there when I was an undergraduate as well, worked there for a few years. And yeah, so all of my propolis research has been, based in Marla's lab and inspired by the work that she and her students have done over the years, looking at the ways that propolis supports honeybee health and stingless bee health, and what can we do to support bees in that natural behavior? Like, what can we do as beekeepers? How can we facilitate that? These smooth wood bee boxes that we commonly use, they don't really stimulate propolis collection in the way a hollow tree cavity would. So what are the modifications we can make to the beehives that we use, just so that the bees can?
So to encourage the bees. I think you froze. Your video froze.
Oh no.
So you're okay. I'm going to keep that, by the way. I'm not going to delete it because you didn't have your mouth open or anything. It was good. Okay, so that's interesting because the propolis has a lot of attention, and I know that there are discussions about propolis traps and putting those in your beehives to encourage the bees to, of course, fill those tiny gaps and create this propolis. Is it propolis or propolis, or does it matter which way you pronounce that?
Potato. Different people use different things. Do what's right for you.
Yeah, because Webster says propolis, and you say propolis for the population. I get it. Okay, so
yeah, and actually, so part of my PhD research is comparing beehives that have those propolis traps stapled to the interior walls of the hive.
Okay.
And comparing that environment to just wood box hives with a roughened wood texture. Comparing the amount of propolis that bees bring into those different environments, and what effect does that have on colony health.
So are you successful in roughening the surface of a smooth pine board, for example, and then encouraging the bees to propolize that?
So for the experiments we ran, a beekeeper from Minnesota by the name of Christian Dom created these rough wood boxes for us, and he has a sawmill, and so he has this specialized equipment that allows him to achieve these really like deep roughened grooves And that's been really effective. I've seen lots of ways to do this, and I'm so interested in, every beekeeper has their own way of roughening their box. And I'm so interested in all these, like creative solutions that people are coming up with. I've seen people use a power washer to roughen the wood texture.
Interesting. Yeah.
In the past, in Marla's lab, some students used wire brushes. And what we've learned through this process is really just the rougher, the better. Just like take that hollow tree cavity, use it as a model, and try to create that in the hive. And yeah.
And so why do the bees bother? They find a rough surface. It's obviously very porous and could hold on to moisture and bacteria and things like that. So why are the bees sealing all of that up, for example? It's just instinctively they find porous material and they either chew it away or put propolis on it.
That is a really good question. And I would love to be inside a bee head to know what their exact motivation is in that circumstance.
You really want to be inside a bee head?
Maybe
because they're the biggest brained insects, is that right?
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would look to Tom Seeley's work on that. He's done so much of the seminal work on, the behaviors around propolis collection and propolis processing inside the hive. What we're seeing is when you just create this rough wood texture, they respond to it. And I think it was Mike Simone Finstrom, who is also a bee researcher. He's at the USDA. I think that he also did experiments at one point. And I hope I'm not wrong about this, but I think he was the one that compared resin foragers to other nectar and pollen foragers, and found that resin foragers were more reactive to the stimulus of sensing a small gap.
Oh yeah, and it was Tom Seeley that also pointed out that they will move into a cavity that has crevices small enough for them to repair. But if the openings higher up in that cavity were not small enough for them to propolize, they would avoid it then. So it's kind of interesting. Darn, I just lost my train of thought on something. But I know that backyard beekeepers, which are the bulk of the people that watch my channel, are all going to want to know what they can do to get bees to propolize the interior walls of their hives. One of the problems I have kind of with cutting the surface, because I have access to rough cut lumber that is full dimensional lumber, but a 1x10 or whatever is actually only 3/4 of an inch thick already. So for them to carve into that more just to encourage the bees to propolize it is not at the top of my list of things to do to that. But one of the things that people ask about is surfacing it with cork, for example. Does cork encourage bees to propolize the surface?
I have no experience with cork. That is not something that we tested.
Okay.
One thing we did find, so with the propolis traps that you can staple to the interior walls, the issue that we had with that, and Renata Borba was the first one, also a bee researcher from Marla's lab, to test this in colonies. So propolis traps are effective in that they encourage bees to build that propolis envelope, and there are benefits to colony health. The issue there is when you put something inside the hive on the surface of the interior walls, you're reducing the space in there. You're making it really difficult to move your frames. We trialed this as part of our experiment for one summer. It's so hard to get, like in July, in August, it's so hard to get your frames back in there, without crushing bees. There's just not a lot of space to move.
Yeah, so you've kind of defeated bee space by doing that.
Yeah, I mean, if you had a larger box and then place the traps inside, you wouldn't have the space issue. But part of the reason that we've been so keen on the rough box option is you can take the box you already have, you can alter the texture. And for, backyard beekeepers out there, I mean, the rough box texture that we tried was, found to be effective. And I know that Christian will be producing these boxes commercially for sale at a certain point.
Is there a company associated with Christian? Or is he going to work through like Man Lake or Better Bee or?
No, he created his own company, and I'd be happy to send you that information. Maybe you can include that, in the notes below the video.
Yeah, I would like to.
It's called something like Propolis Hive Company. And so he's working now on how to scale up his production to make those boxes available.
That's really interesting. And people will be very interested in that because he's going to have a larger box to accommodate the propolizing and everything. And that rough cut lumber is something a lot of people just can't do themselves.
I don't know if the box is larger. I think the box is the same dimension. I think it's a relatively shallow cut.
Just, okay,
Yeah,
so just the surface configuration.
yeah.
Okay.
I'll
Well,
have to
it will
ask
be
him to send you
explained
one
on
of those so you can check it out as
his
well.
website will explain it. But there's another aspect to this because again, when people ask and they want to know why aren't my bees propolizing and they're not doing diddly, and then some other people will say they've brought in so much propolis that it's pooling on the bottom. And I understand that Africanized bees are heavy propolizers. So it's not all bees propolize equally, right?
That is true. And one of the projects that's ongoing in Marla's lab at the moment in the Spivak lab is this breeding project where propolis collection is a criteria, a selection criteria in the bees that she is breeding, just recognizing that this is such an important behavior, so important to bee health. And you can give them the box, but if they don't have, you can give them you can give them a rough box, and some bees will put a ton of propolis on it and some won't put a ton. So if we can work towards selecting for bees that bring in more propolis, we can sort of come at this from multiple angles.
Mm-hmm. So when honeybees are out foraging and they get pollen and they come into the hive, they take their pollen directly to the cells and they scratch it off in the cells, and then the nurse bees work it up later. When they come through and they have propolis on their hind legs, it's thought that the foragers can't get that off themselves, that they need help from other bees inside the hive. Is that true?
Yeah, and they have this sort of unloading dynamic where they then go towards the site of where the propolis could be unloaded and then hope that somebody's going to help them out. I mean, I can't get propolis off myself either, so I can relate to that issue.
Yeah, I guess that's true. We get that on our hive tools and everything else. It's very sticky stuff.
And one thing that I haven't seen the research on this in honeybees, but in stingless bees, I did look into it. People were looking at stingless bees and trying to figure out, do they just have these non-stick structures? Is it like a non-stick pan so that they can then just remove the propolis, or are they producing secretions that then help them? Because how does a bee unload propolis and then not have that residue in her corbiculae? It's a mystery.
Now, I'm going to ask this too then. So a bee that forages for pollen, are they specialists? So in other words, those that are gathering propolis, do they exclusively gather propolis and not pollen? Or do they change based on the trips that they're taking, where once they're committed, that's all they do?
That is a really good question. I feel like I should know the answer for honeybees, but I don't want to say the wrong thing. In stingless bees, they'll switch back and forth. Okay. There will be some bees that are like, I'm a propolis bee for life, and that's all they're going to do. There are other bees that will switch back between propolis and pollen and even nectar foraging.
Okay, that's interesting. And you also said that with the stingless bees, they have a higher water content in the honey that they store. So I'm curious, how do they prevent fermentation of that stored honey?
I think that they don't. So fermentation actually can happen in the hive and even post-harvest. Like fermentation is even an integral process for some beekeepers. They harvest their honey and then they let it sit for a certain amount of time so that it will, fully mature and actually ferment. And the fermentation process does change the properties of the honey. And I don't know if it makes some nutrients more available, but yeah, fermentation happens inside the hive and post-harvest.
That's interesting. So that makes that stuff not great for those who would be gathering honey for human consumption, because then it would continue to almost turn to mead, right?
Yeah, I really don't fully understand like the long-term implications for fermentation on stingless bee honey. I don't. It makes it difficult in terms of like regulations for honey sale, in terms of the kinds of regulations you'd need to have in place for international sale, since so much honey does ferment naturally. What do you do with that? How do you create a controlled and standardized process that recognizes that major variable.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a puzzle. But fermented honey, stingless bee honey is not bad. It's not a bad thing.
It
It's
isn't
not bad for
any,
you. You can still consume it.
you don't see any hydrogen peroxide on the surface of that honey?
What would hydrogen peroxide look like on the surface of honey?
Hydrogen peroxide, you see it a lot on honey. It just looks like white foam right on the surface.
Oh,
And so people
huh.
do have discussions about how to get it off of their honey. Usually it's because the honey's come in contact with water.
Huh.
So
Interesting.
you haven't looked into hydrogen peroxide that honey makes?
No, I'm aware of honey making hydrogen peroxide and that being a part of its antibacterial activity.
Yeah, it's kind of a defensive property of honey, but yeah, it comes from the honey that just
Yeah.
shows
So
up
the
as a
stingless
little
bee
white.
honey that we've harvested, has produced a lot of foam. So I didn't realize
Mhm.
that would be hydrogen peroxide. That's so interesting.
Yeah, that may actually be what's going on. Okay, so we're kind of all over the chart now. So back to your paper that you did, and what is your future research looking like? What are you delving into? What do you hope to accomplish before you're all done with everything?
Before I'm done with my PhD or after
Mhm.
that?
Well, we could talk about both, but what do you have to do to complete your PhD?
I have a couple more experiments to finish up so that I can finish my PhD. One of those is looking at how the presence of propolis in stingless beehives impacts mold growth. So is the propolis that we find in stingless beehives in high quantity helping to manage the microbial communities that naturally occur in stingless bee nests? So that's one. That's coming up this next month here in Mexico. And then in the summer, we will head back to Minnesota for one last experiment where we will look at whether propolis, when honeybees come into propolis at very high doses and in very close quarters, does that affect their survivorship and does that affect their immune response? And part of that is, propolis is a really powerful combination of chemical compounds, right? Naturally occurring, but has so many different like antimicrobial effects and so much biological activity. We're wondering whether at high levels propolis could be toxic to honeybees. And that's an important question for me in part because as a propolis researcher, I get a lot of questions from beekeepers about how to apply propolis to the colony. Is it something I can spray on? Is it something I can dump in? What do I do to get the propolis in there? We know that it's good, so then how can I help make that happen? And one major concern there is, if we humans are applying propolis in ways that we don't understand, we could actually have a negative impact on honeybee health. Propolis at high doses could be toxic to bees. Or applied in certain ways. So a lot of my research has been around how do we as beekeepers make it more possible so that bees can bring in the propolis themselves and in a way we know will be safe for them and actually support their health.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that because that was on my list of questions to ask because everybody wants to help their bees. So they want to make a shellac out of propolis and paint their hive interiors with it and mix it with everything else. So we recommend people don't do their own propolis application because we don't have the same sensibility about that the honeybees do.
Right.
And then of course, there are things that the bees are contributing to that when they work it into the surface of the hive as well.
Yeah, there's supposed to be these glandular secretions that they add to that material. And so we can give them the substrate, we can give them the rough box so they can put the propolis. So they can build the propolis envelope. We can breed for propolis collection behavior and favor those bees that are making use of that natural defense. And then another thing we can do is we can identify plants on the landscape that produce resin, and we can propagate those. We can pay more attention, like the way we pay attention to what's in bloom. Where is the nectar that these bees are relying on? Let's also look at how can we put more resin on the landscape so that they also have, those diverse options.
And I'm really glad that you touched on that, because that was going to be my next question. Is because all propolis is not equal, so it has to have something to do with the source plant, the tree. So when they're bringing it in, so environment could play here, for example, and time of year, because isn't most propolis gathering occurring in spring, or is there a season where more propolis is gathered and then kind of through the year the bees kind of rework it inside the hive? Or are they gathering year round, other than, of course, when they can't fly because it's freezing or something?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, except anecdotally what I've observed in our hives. We see propolis foraging occur throughout the foraging season. And it's hard to decouple the amount of resin, is there more resin coming in because the colony is bigger and there are more foragers, or is it that this is a time where it's more important to have more resin? We see bees responding to brood disease like chalk brood. And when that disease is present, we see them increase resin collection, propolis collection.
Oh.
I use resin and propolis interchangeably. That can be confusing.
So they could be activated by some disease that's occurring inside the hive, which stimulates more resin gathering.
Yeah, so it's
that's interesting.
I think, resin can be talked about in terms of like a form of self or social medication, something that the bees are bringing in to address some kind of threat or stressor or pathogen that they are perceiving inside the hive. Yeah.
I like that. That's interesting. So the other thing is, we know that when the bees are working up honeycomb inside the hive, when they're building their own wax, they need a certain temperature to be able to do that well, or they have to heat the wax in order to do it, which is not very practical for the bees. So are there temperature parameters where the bees are working more with propolis, or when it gets too cold, they back off on it? Because I kind of tell people, don't break open your beehives when it's cold, because then the bees won't be able to seal it as they would, for example, on a nice warm day. So what are your observations on temperature and propolis production?
Yeah, propolis is more brittle at low temperatures and more malleable at higher temperatures. In terms of resin collection or propolis foraging, what we've seen in stingless bees is it'll need to warm up a bit in the day before the stingless bees will go collect that resin, just because if it's too chilly, it's not workable. It's going to be much more difficult to remove from the plant. But I'm sure the beekeepers tuning in have seen and experienced, the different textures that propolis takes on at different temperatures. And I'm not sure exactly what those temperature thresholds are, but there definitely is an effect. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of beekeepers go through their beehives and they're scraping off honeycomb, they're scraping off bird comb, and they're scraping propolis away, and then you'll see them stick wads of it in their mouth.
Yeah.
And people will swear that propolis is good for mouth sores and it's the best medicinal gum you can chew. And are there medicinal properties to propolis that are good for people that you know of?
Oh, I'm glad you brought this up. So there is actually a ton of research on the benefits of propolis to human health. It's much more of an extensive field than the benefits of propolis to bee health. And when Marla first started investigating the benefits of propolis to bee health, it was recognizing that disparity. There's so much going on in the human health field. Propolis is, helping suppress the growth. Well, okay, disclaimer, not a doctor. I'm
Right.
thinking about the propolis studies that
We're
I've
just
read.
talking. Yeah, we're just.
Yeah.
So
But the antibacterial, antifungal activity it has, the way it supports the human immune system. I actually have propolis tincture here. My family, we take propolis tincture. When we're coming down with something, we collect it from our hives. Yeah, I've got some brewing right here. Do you want to see it?
Sure, please show it.
This was not a planned show and tell, but
Right.
This is a bottle. It's actually an olive oil bottle, but you want like a dark glass because you don't want direct light exposure on the propolis because it will
Yeah.
affect its properties. And it's just a mixture of, you can't really see, but propolis chunks that we harvested from Propolis Traps in our hive.
Yeah.
And a strong kind of alcohol, which extracts the beneficial properties. And then we, filter it and take it in drops. Not a doctor. This is just one thing that we do.
No, it's
And
just,
funny story, we're doing this in this bottle that was formerly olive oil.
mhm.
We left it at my mother-in-law's house. A neighbor came by and asked if she had any extra olive oil she could share. She poured out some propolis tincture into this person's cup, and they just had a very unpleasant surprise. They were like, "What happened to your olive oil?"
Yeah. That's really interesting. So you say, what's the dose? Like what are the percentages of alcohol and propolis and to make that tincture that you have there in your bottle? Because I know somebody's going to ask, so we should hand it
Yeah.
off.
Well, I'll say what I do, and then there are a lot of resources available. If you research apitherapy,
Mhm.
propolis consumption or propolis as a medicine is a huge component of apitherapy, and there's a lot of information, like formal research studies, and also information online about how to prepare and consume these products. Ours, we prepare a 30% solution. So weight of propolis to milliliters of alcohol. And one thing I learned in a propolis as human medicine course that I took here in Mexico was that you want a strong alcohol, but you also want an alcohol that has some amount of water content. If you use like 96% ethanol, for example, and you want to use an alcohol that's fit for human consumption. But if the alcohol is too strong, you won't be able to extract as many of the flavonoids, I believe, which are extracted in water. So yeah, 30% solution, you mix it up. For about a week, you shake it every day, you protect it from direct sunlight, and then you filter it. And we take 30 drops at a time in water, and my parents mix it with honey. And if you want a really exact concentration, like if you're taking this for a medical issue with the advice of some kind of medical practitioner, then you'll need to do some back calculating, like take some drops of your tincture, evaporate off the alcohol, figure out the weight of the propolis, so that you can adjust the quantity of alcohol so that you can get a really precise concentration in there. Not a doctor. This is just what we do at home.
Right. We're just talking.
Yeah.
We're just sharing. But I'm glad you're saying that, because there's so many, so much anecdotal evidence about propolis and its benefits. And there's another aspect that I want to ask you about again, staying with propolis a little bit. We have swarm traps coming up this time of year. People are going to be putting them out. And I always recommend dropping bits and pieces of propolis in the bottom and old frame beeswax and things like that, because the scouts will smell that and zip right in there. But some people have talked about making a spray with propolis, and not only using it on the interior surfaces of their hives to make it appealing to the bees, but instead of smoke, they're trying to spray their bees with water that just has a whole bunch of propolis chunks in it. Do you know anything about that? Or
In order to subdue the bees?
Yeah, they think that just spritzing it with water calms the bees, like a rainstorm would or something, that keeps them clustered while they're doing their inspection and things like that. But they're adding bits of propolis to the water as well. And propolis wouldn't necessarily be soluble. Like you said, you needed alcohol to do that. So do you know of anything like that?
I mean, I've seen this done. I've seen people use sugar water for a similar effect. I wasn't aware of the propolis strategy. You're right. I don't think many propolis compounds would be soluble without some amount of work.
Right.
Just the raw propolis in water. But then again, coming back to like propolis in nature, honeybees are not getting bringing propolis into the hive to apply it as a spray to their bodies, right? And I think as we think about how to use propolis, we really need to take their lead
Mhm.
and not try to expose them to any kind of environment that they, that
Mhm.
might be harmful to their health.
Oh yeah, you don't want to be spraying your bees with anything sticky like that. We already know they can't get it off their legs even when they put it there themselves. So we don't want to kind of hose them down. But okay, so there's a lot of information here for people, but I'm glad we're addressing things like it is a frequent question. Everybody wants to
Mm,
help their bees. Everyone wants to encourage propolis. So we know that some bees are doing it more than others. It depends on the surface condition of the wood that would inspire
mhm.
the bees to propolize it and seal it up. We don't know about cork surfaces. Sometimes they propolize polystyrene.
Oh,
So do
wow.
you have anything to lend to polystyrene as an interior surface? Sometimes it's the telescoping cover of the hive.
Mm,
Bmax makes them, Lysin makes them.
mm,
And the bees I've seen them do one of two things. One, they chew away at it.
mm.
So, and then somebody else explained that's almost like rotted wood because it's fairly porous. So they're actually trying to
Huh.
chew away until they reach a more solid
Interesting.
material. Then they propolize it. And
Yeah.
others will just propolize it completely.
Huh. I don't know anything about that, but I do just want to say that for all those beekeepers out there trying these different surface texture treatments and inventing their own ways, like
Mhm.
you could just drop my email address into the notes for this show. And I'm so curious about, what other people have observed and what solutions that they've found. Just because we're based in a research lab doesn't mean we've found the one and only way to do it. So
Mhm.
I'd love to hear from folks that are trying things in their own hives.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we just don't want them to have to cover ground that's already been done, so that,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
okay. So what else do you want to say about the paper that you wrote? And what else would you like to share for backyard beekeepers and sideliners? What can they be doing? We can't do a lot. It's nice to know about our industrial scale agriculture that's going on. Most of us are not players in that field. So for backyard beekeepers, what kind of action could they be taking to help with the environment and their bees in general?
Yeah, it's interesting that you make the comment that, backyard beekeepers, just the average person working with bees and supporting bee health, that we're not major players. I sometimes feel the same way, in the bee research environment. And I feel like as individuals, it can be so daunting to take on such a massive system. Um, and so I share that. And I think that we need to organize anyway. We need to feel the size and scale of the task that we're taking on, and still strive to take action. And so my call to action for bee researchers has just been, to name industrial agriculture, to look at the problem that we're facing so that we can collectively address it. And for backyard beekeepers, I would say the same. I would say, let's go beyond, the bee box. Let's go beyond the issues that we're observing. It makes sense to do everything we can, to manage our bees so that they can be healthy, and to explore all of our options for supporting bee health, in our beehives. But let's also look at the root issues that are causing our bees to be unhealthy. Let's look at industrial agriculture. I think beekeepers getting together, organizing, taking collective action to transform our food system, I think that's a really powerful thing. I see it happening, and I think there's so much potential there.
Hmm. That's a really good message. So the other thing I want to ask you is, because the message is kind of help the bees help themselves through environmental sustainability and rewilding, or allowing areas to have more diversity that the bees can exploit then so that they survive. So is your message kind of to veer away from supplementing bee diets or adding essential oil mixes? And because a lot of backyard beekeepers just want to do everything they can for their bees, so that kind of translates into every treatment, medication, boosted formula that comes down the pike. They want to add to their bees water. They want to put patties in the hives. They want to add things to the syrup that they're feeding their bees. What are your thoughts on medicating bees with boosted resources like that?
In terms of my own beekeeping practices, those are things that I tend to avoid. I can also relate to, the impulse to want to give your bees a boost, want to do everything you can for them. And I would just, in my own practice, in my own life, when I feel that impulse, what I'm trying to do is reframe, right? I want to do everything I can for my bees instead of going towards that product that could, going towards that product. I'm going to look outside the hive. I'm going to try to help create conditions where I'm in an environment that can support bee health. And I think it's important to connect that, a lot of us are so focused on honeybee health. Many of us are also increasingly connected to wild bee health and wild bee populations and understanding how, our fates are tied together. So, thinking about what action can I take that will have a global positive impact, understanding that my bees are connected to, the other pollinators, the other insects in the environment, experiencing the same kind of thing. So let me take a long term, let me make a bigger reach to try to make a difference here.
So is your approach to beekeeping more holistic? For example, do you treat for varroa destructor mites and things like that? Are there treatments that you approve of and use, or are you treatment free and making observations on how well the bees cope?
Yeah, we currently treat our hives here with oxalic acid. And it's, we've been working in the US for the past, my husband is also a beekeeper. We do this work together. He comes from a beekeeping family here in Mexico. And so, his brothers and our nephews and nieces are in on this as well. But it's a difficult or a tough comparison to make between the US and Mexico, because here in Mexico, bees can handle higher varroa loads without experiencing parasitic mite syndrome or, so many of these negative health impacts. There's more resilience in the bee populations here. But yeah, we currently treat high varroa loads with oxalic acid. And, I wouldn't say that I'm an expert or even an example to follow. I think treatment-free is definitely a possibility in southern Mexico, where there are, there's a thriving feral population where bees don't succumb to, there isn't rampant colony loss. So we're just in a whole different environment down here for sure. So yeah, I would be cautious about applying anything happening here to any other part of the world or really any other operation. It's really a case by case basis.
Are most of the feral colonies down where you are of honeybees, are they Apis mellifera scutellata? Are they Africanized bees?
Yeah, yep. Everything in our area is Africanized. I mean, there are some beekeepers here in Chiapas that bring in, I don't know what the term would be in English, but they basically bring in a mated queen from the US to try to get more European genetics here in our populations. And that was a thing that occurred, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years ago. There was a real concerted effort to do that, just to breed out some of the defensive behavior. But when I see that happening now, I get so concerned because, I mean, people bring in whole colonies to breed from. They're bringing the same diseases that are, rampant in the US, and we don't want to model our system down here on what's occurring in the US. It's like you said, I think there's so much that can, that Latin America and Mexico have to offer in terms of things that folks in the US could learn, and on a systems level that we could learn.
That's really interesting too. So yeah, genetics play across the board. So now you've got your PhD. What are you going to do?
So I'm really interested in continuing on this thread, continuing to look at the impacts of industrial agriculture on on bees and on beekeeping practices. That's been something that I've been looking at, mostly focusing on honeybees in the US. But I also see the way that these industrializing forces are playing out in stingless beekeeping. How increasingly folks are moving from the hollow tree cavity to the standardized smooth wood box. We are learning more about what that means for propolis collection, but what do these, zooming out a little bit, what do these changes in general mean for bee health? And so I'm interested in, studying and better understanding both the ways that industrial agriculture and the massification of these food system practices, how does that impact bee health? And also I'm really interested in the things that beekeepers around the world are doing to resist those forces. How are beekeepers keeping it small scale, keeping their bees healthy, in spite of everything going on around them?
Is there a model now somewhere in the world that you think is really showing the way? Is there some other country where they've figured it out?
Well, I'm really inspired by some of the work that's being done in Mexico now in stingless bee spaces. So there is an organization, for example, called INANA, INANA, that really does good work to support stingless bee health. And they are acknowledging and calling attention to the ways in which, it's called technification and massification, all these changes that are happening in stingless beekeeping. They're saying like, hey, let's slow down. Let's take the lead from the bees. Let's look at what changes can we make to the environment to support them. They were some of the first people that really called me to this different kind of lens, different analysis of, instead of looking inside the hive, let's start with the land, what's happening on the land and how can that be instructive? How can that guide our action? And then like, how do those positive actions, how do those positive changes then show up in our hive? And yeah, I've seen a lot of good work in Latin America in that sense. And yeah, I'd love to learn more about it. And yeah, for sure.
So that's what you're gonna do. Well, Maggie, I want to thank you for spending so much of your time with me and for sharing, a really broad range of things, a lot of it very applicable to backyard beekeepers that they can put into practice right away. We'll put all the links down in the video description. I hope you get some really good ideas through email. I've got a fly right here. That fly's in jeopardy. It doesn't even realize what can happen to it. This is my fly assault. Anyway, thanks for being here. And a lot of good stuff, especially about the propolis and everything else. For those of you watching, and if you're here at the very end, you're dedicated. So thank you for still being here. It'll all be in the description, and maybe down the road, we'll do a follow-up. Who knows? So thanks again. And I hope you have a fantastic end of the week and that all your bees are doing fantastic down there in Mexico.
Yeah, thanks so much, Fred. Good to be with you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, goodbye.
That's it for today, and thank you for joining me and Maggie Shanahan for another interview with experts. Find the entire playlist at thewaytobee.org or right here on YouTube. If you like this series, please leave a comment, and thank you for being here.